Hello everyone, this is Ayushi Gupta. Welcome to the 18th episode of Microsoft Hour of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving the skills of people in their employability. Now let me tell you a little more about the Microsoft Hour of Code. Microsoft Hour of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technology topics related to programming and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. Today, we are going to learn the C# fundamentals. This is a beginner's course for the people pursuing computer science. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. These courses are not only beneficial for students, but also for working people. If you are working in an IT firm and wish for promotion, these courses can do a lot for you. If you are certified in C, Java, C++, SQL, etc., you can get a definite increment in your salary from 6 to 20%. As you know, today, we are going to learn the C# fundamentals. This content has been created by our partner, Microsoft. We have Bob Tabor from Microsoft with us, who will help you learn the fundamentals of C#. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor. If you have a computer with a 32-bit processor, that is also fine. But in case a particular program is of 64 bits, it would not work on a 32-bit computer system. Check which type of processor your computer has. You can use the System Information utility. Search for either System Information or MS Info 32 from the Start menu. Under the System Summary, you will see the type of system listed next to the system type. If you see x64 base PC, you have a 64-bit processor. If you see x86 base PC, you have a 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer, which needs to be installed on your computer system. Learn C#, get the tools, see how to write the code, debug features, explore customization, and much more. In this course, C# for beginners, let's have a look at what all we are going to be learning. Learn how to declare and utilize arrays, create and use methods, use iteration statements, manipulate strings. Learn how to work with date and time data. Define and create classes and use properties. Apply more advanced class details. Contrast variable scope and accessibility modifiers. Find and use namespaces. Create and reference assemblies. See how to use collections. Learn when and how to use link. Use enumerations. Prevent exceptions. See a demo on how to handle events. Explore next steps to learn more about developing Windows and web applications. Understand course expectations and obtain software. Create an application. Understand C# grammar. Discover the relationship between projects and solutions. Learn the fundamental building blocks of working with C#. Use if decision statements and the conditional operator. Create a properly formed C# statement and resolve compilation errors. Understand iteration statements and when to use them. See a demo on how to declare and utilize arrays. Create and use methods. Use iteration statements. Manipulate strings. Learn how to work with date and time data. Define and create classes and use properties. Use if declaration statements and the conditional operator. See a demo on how to declare and utilize arrays. So let's move towards the course. We have divided the course into 8 parts, so let's begin with part 1. The topics we are going to cover in this episode are course introduction, in which we will learn about the series, get tips on how to get the most out of it, and find out where to download the software you need. creating your first C# program, in which we will learn how to code a simple application and get an explanation of common solutions to different problems that you might encounter as you begin writing and compiling code. Understanding your first C# program, in which we will better understand the grammar of C# at high level, return to the program we just built to break apart each of the keywords and symbols. Working with code file projects and solutions, in which we will learn how to open and close individual files in a project. The relationship between projects, solutions, and more. So let's get started.
Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University, and I welcome you to this course covering the fundamentals of the C# programming language and programming topics in general, designed specifically for absolute beginners to programming. Now, if you're already an experienced software developer coming from another software development platform or programming language, then frankly, this series of lessons will move much too slowly for you. You might be better served to find another resource to use as a starting point, one with you, the experienced beginner to C# in mind. And Microsoft Virtual Academy has many great courses designed for people at all skill levels, so I recommend that you start your search there. However, if you are completely new to programming, and you're new to the C# programming language, and you're new to building applications on the Windows platform, then this perhaps is the best place for you to start. Not only will you and I work together to learn the syntax of C#, but I'm going to take the time to walk through everything that we do together. I'll explain what we're doing, but more importantly, I want to explain why we're doing it, the thought process behind it. I'm going to try to anticipate the questions you might have, anticipate the problems that you might run into as you're typing your very first lines of code into the code window, or as you're working through some of the exercises that we'll work through together. I've literally taught hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions of people, C# over the past 14 years. That's no exaggeration. This includes children as old as 8 years old and as young as 80 years old from virtually every corner of the world. They've all learned from a version of this course, and I know you can learn too. In fact, this is the 6th iteration of this very course, dating all the way back to 2005. And over the years, I've incorporated the feedback from thousands of students, feedback and suggestions on how to improve the course. I've incorporated those in an effort to make sure that this is the very best effort that I can put forward to help you get your feet wet with C#. Now, I only make one real assumption as we begin this course, and that's that you already have some version and edition of Visual Studio already installed on your local computer, and you're ready to write your very first lines of code. Now, if you don't already have Visual Studio installed, then please, by all means, visit visualstudio.com, where you'll learn about the many free and commercial editions of Visual Studio that are available, what the differences are. Now, personally, I used Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition, one of the free versions of Visual Studio that are available on visualstudio.com. And I want to emphasize that you can use any edition and version of Visual Studio with these lessons. Now, there might be tiny user interface differences between what you see on my screen and what you see on your screen as you work through the videos. However, I'm not going to be focusing on any specific features of Visual Studio, so hopefully that won't prevent you from following along no matter what. There will be other courses on Microsoft Virtual Academy that will demonstrate the power of Visual Studio, all the features that Visual Studio has to offer, explaining the differences between editions and versions of Visual Studio. But I won't be focusing on that in this course. I'm going to focus specifically on the basics of the C# programming language itself, and what I will demonstrate will be true no matter which version or edition of Visual Studio that you choose to use. And that's great news, because as long as C# exists, these lessons should still be valid and useful to you no matter what. So to get the most out of this course or any course that you find online, you really should become an active learner, and that takes several different forms. First of all, you should attempt to follow along closely and do what I call getting your hands dirty in the code, actually writing the code that I'm writing on screen, you're writing it along with me. All right? There's no better way to learn how to code than actually write code yourself. It's like suggesting that somebody learn how to play the guitar without ever touching a guitar. You'd think, well, that's virtually impossible. Typing in the code yourself will give you insights that merely watching videos won't. So pause the video, rewind the video, rewatch portions of the videos as you need to. I'm going to make the code available for download, and you're welcome to it. And you can use that to compare the code that you write versus the code that I've written in the videos. But you really should be typing in everything on your own in your own local copy of Visual Studio running on your desktop. So also, don't rush through this course. If something doesn't make sense, again, pause the video, rewind the video, rewatch those portions that don't make complete sense at first. Sometimes a second or a third viewing, focusing more specifically on what's going on around the screen and on the words that I'm saying can help. Being an active learner also means that you're taking control of the process of learning. So if I say something or do something that doesn't completely make sense, by all means, find a second or a third resource that can help you. Maybe it's an article out on msdn.microsoft.com or other videos on Channel 9 or Microsoft Virtual Academy. But make sure you search out those resources that resonate well for you. If you're interested in an even more comprehensive version of this course, of a C# training course that covers a lot more ground and more depth, complete with dozens of coding challenges and over 30 hours of video instruction, then please visit my own website, devview.com, Developer University. You'll also find many other training courses that I've created designed specifically to help you become a professional C# developer someday. Furthermore, over time, as we go through this course and as I begin to field questions about it, I might add some study resources and additional free content related to the topics in the course that you're currently watching right now. So that's another reason to be sure to visit me at devview.com. Now, like I said earlier, if you're new to programming, I'm really excited for you. Learning to write applications is really one of my life's passions. It's extremely gratifying to breathe life into your imagination and watch your creations come to life and watch other people actually then use your applications. You're embarking on a really exciting journey that's immersive, it's personally and professionally rewarding, and best of all, I know you can do this. Again, I've seen so many people start off where you're at right now, and they might even be working professionally writing code for a living or building real applications that are being sold in app stores like the Windows Store. So if you've ever gotten stuck in the past in trying to learn how to program, I promise you that if you put in the time and you put in the effort and you work along with me, as we work together, we're going to build the knowledge of C# that you need to be well equipped to move on to more advanced tutorials where you can learn how to build your own web applications and Windows applications, Windows Store applications, cloud services, video games, and even applications that will run on iOS and Android using C#. Now, assuming, again, that you have some version and edition of Visual Studio already installed and you're ready to go, then we're going to begin writing C# in the very next lesson. I hope you're excited because I really am. This is so much fun. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devview.com. In this lesson, I want to build a super simple C# application. I want you to follow along. It's a hello world application, meaning that we're merely going to print out the words hello world to a console window. And the point of this exercise is just to show you the basic workflow. So I'm not going to attempt to even explain why we're doing what we're doing. The focus will be on what I'm going to do next and how I'm doing it. In other words, I want you to focus on the basic workflow. That'll be the same for all the applications we'll build in this course and pretty much every application you'll ever build using C#. Things like how to create a new project. Where do you type in your C# code? How do you test your application to make sure that it's running correctly? And what do you do whenever you have an error in your code? How do you save your project? Things of that nature. So for now, just try to follow along. Don't worry if something doesn't make a lot of sense at this point. That's really what the rest of this course is for. In the next few lessons after this one, we're going to dissect this tiny little application that we built. And I'm going to explain at that point why we did what we did. And then what does the code mean and why it's doing what it's doing. And just a quick reminder, like I said in the previous video, the introduction of this course, I'm going to assume that you have some version and some edition of Visual Studio already installed. Even if your Visual Studio looks a little bit different than mine does on camera here, don't be overly concerned about that. The basics are the same no matter what, I promise. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. And to begin, we're going to create a new project. There are a number of different ways to do this, but I'm going to keep it simple and go to File, New, Project. And selecting that menu option will open up the New Project dialog. Now, chances are the number of items that you see here in this center part will be dramatically different than the items that I see based on which version and edition of Visual Studio that you have installed. However, you should be able to select templates and then select C#, and one of the options should be a console application. All right, so I want you to select that, and then we're going to rename this project to Hello World. Now notice I used a little naming convention where I use a capital H in Hello and a capital W in World, and I don't use a space in between the two words. Now that's just a naming convention that I came up with to help me identify projects a little bit easier, something I recommend that you follow. We shouldn't have to make any other changes in this dialog. I'm going to go ahead and click the OK button, and Visual Studio will go off and now create the starting point of a console window application for us. All right, and so now you should see in this main area, in this text area, a file open called program.cs, and there's some code here that is already generated for us, boilerplate code. We're going to ignore most of that, except we're going to find this innermost set of curly braces. Now, one of the first things you're going to need to do when you're learning how to develop software is tell the difference between parentheses, curly braces, square brackets, angle brackets, and I don't know that I left out any, okay? But here we want the curly braces, look like little mustaches turned on their side. These are important. And I want to go inside of those two, that opening and closing curly brace, and make some room for ourselves. This is where we're going to type our code. So it's approximately line 13 and 14, at least in my copy of Visual Studio. And then I'm going to type in the following. I type in console, and you may notice now this little window pops up below what I'm typing. You can safely ignore that for now. Eventually this becomes our best friend, but for now it might kind of be distracting and get in the way. Just try to ignore it and type in everything by hand to the best of your ability. Console, and then I want to use the period on the keyboard. I'm going to call it the dot. So console dot, and then capital W, right, capital L, line. Next, I'm going to use an opening and closing parentheses. So that's not a curly brace. These are just the like the characters you would use for a smiley face in an emoticon, okay? And then inside of there, I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to kind of navigate around here. I'm going to go inside of the opening and closing parenthesis, and I'm going to use two double quotes, so it should look like that. All right, make sure you don't use single quotation marks like that. That's not what we want. We want double quotation marks like that, okay? And inside of there, we're going to type in the words hello and world. All right, so make sure that you have an open parenthesis, a double quote, the words hello world, then another double quote, then another parenthesis, a closing parenthesis, and then at the very end of this line I'm going to use a semicolon, and it looks like that. All right, so it's not a colon and it's not a comma. All right, it looks like that. All right, and then I'm going to use the enter key on my keyboard to go to the next line. I'm going to type in console dot capital read capital L in line opening and closing parenthesis. Now you may have noticed that as you type in the opening parenthesis, that Visual Studio will automatically type in a closing one for you. Don't let that throw you. You can continue just to type through that, but make sure that you have exactly what I've typed into my code window here for these 2 lines of code. Make sure that the capitalization is correct. Make sure that you're using a period, not a comma, for the little mark that comes after the word console. Make sure you're using parentheses and not some other type of bracket or brace, and then make sure that both lines of code end with a semicolon. All right. So the next thing that I want to do is save my project. So I'm going to go, and there are a number of different ways to do this in Visual Studio. Again, I'm going to keep it simple and go to File, Save All. All right. And then the next thing I want to do is now see my application actually running. And so to do that, I can either find this little green arrow, this little green triangle that has the word start next to it, or if I don't see that by default in my little toolbar here at the top, I can go to debug and select start debugging. Either way should work. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And you'll notice that some windows pop up and Visual Studio changes its appearance a little bit. Now off to the side of my screen, the console window popped up and we see the words Hello World with a blinking cursor below it. I'm just going to hit the Enter key on my keyboard, and then the console window disappears and I'm back into Visual Studio, kind of resets itself, and we're successful, right? However, maybe your experience wasn't successful. Maybe you saw an error message. So what I want to do is take a moment and look at some common errors that people that are new to C# might run into and how to remedy them. And this is a good opportunity to learn some of the syntax rules of C# as we make mistakes. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video, make a mistake, and then we'll talk about it, pause it, and so on. Alright, so when you attempted to start the application, you may have seen a little dialog pop up from Visual Studio that says there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? Always select no for that, okay? And what you'll see next is a list of errors. Now, in some cases, the error messages will be obvious to you and they'll make a lot of sense. Sometimes they won't, like the verbiage might be something we're just not familiar with yet. Invalid token in class struct or interface, what does that mean? Okay, so typically what you can just do is double click on these and it'll put your mouse cursor on the line where the problem is. Notice that Visual Studio also gives you another visual way to tell that there's a problem with your code. It gives you this little red squiggly line. Sometimes you'll see a blue squiggly line. They're a little bit different, but essentially this is an area of the code that probably deserves your attention, something you need to fix. Now in this particular case, the problem is that we didn't type our code in between the innermost opening and closing curly braces. And so this is an issue with regards to defining a code block in C# or a block of code. So different C# commands belong in different kinds of code blocks. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in this course talking about the different types of code blocks and what belongs in each type of code block. But to remedy this issue, what you need to do is use your mouse and just kind of drag and highlight these 2 lines, or you can use the Shift key on your keyboard and the arrow keys to kind of highlight that area, hit Control X, then move up in between the opening and closing curly brace and paste Control V, that code in there, and then it should run correctly at that point. All right. So that teaches us the first thing about C#. It matters where we type our code. All right. Or when you try to run the application, you may have seen the same build error dialog, except you see the message semicolon expected. Hopefully this is an obvious remedy for you. If you double click on that error in the error list, it should take you to the end of the line of code where you forgot to add a semicolon. And so that's the second thing about C# that we're going to learn, is that just like a properly formed English sentence has to end with a period or a question mark or an exclamation mark, a properly formed instruction in C# has to end with a semicolon. All right. Or maybe the error that you saw was something like a syntax error, something expected, the name hello doesn't exist in the current context, the name world doesn't exist in the current context. If you were to double click these, you'll get to the vicinity of the problem, and you'll also see that there's red squiggly lines beneath the words hello and world in between of our parentheses. Now remember, we needed to use double quotation marks around that string of characters, hello world. And so alphanumeric characters that we want to literally write to screen or present in some way, we need to surround them with characters that indicate that we want to use this literal string, the string of literal characters. Okay, so to do that, we use double quotes. Or perhaps you see the error, something like the name console does not exist in the current context. And you're like, it doesn't exist in the current context. And you look at the word and you say, well, it looks spelled correctly. Remember that I told you you had to type exactly what I was typing. And so C# is case sensitive, meaning that a lowercase c and an uppercase C mean that you're typing two completely different things into C#. Okay, and that is tricky because many of us are not used to that degree of precision whenever we're communicating. But when communicating with a computer, you have to be precise. So in this case, all we needed to do was change the capitalization of the word console, and we're back in business. Or perhaps you see something like console does not contain a definition for either write line or read line, and again you're looking at it and you're thinking it's spelled correctly. Well, what could the problem be? Here again, capitalization is important. Lowercase r read line is different than uppercase r read line, and lowercase l read line is different than uppercase L read line. Okay, and so again, things have to be spelled correctly and have the correct capitalization in order to be processed correctly by the C# compiler. We'll talk about compilation in the next lesson. Now, fortunately, if you're not good at spelling and you're not good at typing and capitalization and you're just not as precise in the way that you would type a letter or an email message or even a text message, fortunately, Visual Studio can help you out. There are tools that will help you not only write your code more quickly, but also more accurately. And chances are, if you utilize those tools, the chances that you will miss some of these really simple syntax things like capitalization will almost be completely eliminated. We'll talk about some of those tools in an upcoming lesson. All right, but assuming that you got all of this to work correctly, you're really well on your way to building applications. You've already crossed over one of the big first steps. And as you undoubtedly learned in this lesson, writing C# code is an exercise in being precise, in precision. And again, fortunately, the Visual Studio IDE will help you out a lot when it comes to that. It will give you clues, and maybe some of the phrases and the words that they use to explain the issue might not be familiar to you yet. With experience, it will be. But generally, it'll point you into the right direction, and with the red squiggly lines in the message, you can typically figure out what the issue is. Now, throughout this course, if you run into a wall and you simply can't figure out what the problem is, do this. Compare character by character. Take your time until you kind of develop a vision for the problems where your eye will jump to the problem in code. Compare what you wrote versus what I wrote. I'll supply the source code to you, and so open it up in a second copy of Visual Studio and then just look character by character. What did I do different than what Bob did? All right, and that will usually help you figure things out if you can't do it on your own. All right, so in the following lessons, we're going to focus on two things. First of all, we're going to talk about why we did what we did and what was going on behind the scenes that turned our code into a working application, albeit a small application. What happens whenever we create a new project? What happens whenever we choose to save our project? What happens whenever we choose to start or run our application? And then secondly, we're going to talk about the syntax of the C# code that we wrote, and we'll learn more syntax rules and more keywords as we go along. So if precision is so very important in C#, then you're going to need to have some explanation as to what all those little words and symbols actually mean, and some rules to guide you as you're writing your own code. It's really easy once you get a few of the basics under your belt. Being completely honest, many people learn how to code, how to write code, and C# is a fairly easy language to learn. You can do this. Just you got to put in a little bit of time, a little bit of effort to figure it out. All right. So we'll begin that process in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. Now in this lesson, we want to start the process of dissecting that little application that we wrote in the previous lesson. Now previously, I wanted you to focus on the workflow, what we did and how we did it. But now what I want to do is focus on why we did what we did. It's really crucial at this point that we cement some really important ideas in your mind, because they're going to provide the basis, the foundation for everything that comes next. So what I want to do is start on the inside and kind of work our way out. And I'll start by talking about the nature of writing code. When you learn how to write applications with C#, really any programming language, learning the syntax of C#, or in other words, learning the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language, is really just half the battle. The other half of the battle is learning about related pre-built functionality that's available to the code that you write. Now in our case, Microsoft has created something called the .NET Framework, which sounds kind of spooky and mysterious, but it's really not that bad. It's actually pretty large, but we're only going to focus on two specific portions of it for our purposes. The first part that I want to focus on is something called the class library, which is simply just a library of code that Microsoft wrote to take care of difficult tasks so that we as software developers, we don't have to worry about them. So there's library code to help with many common sorts of things that many applications will need. Things like working with math, or working with strings and text, and working with dates, manipulating dates and times, maybe displaying things to the computer screen, or transmitting information across a network. So a lot of that kind of foundational stuff that would be difficult for us to write and is utilized by many different applications. So that's really the first part. It's taking advantage and understanding the class library of the .NET Framework. The second part of the .NET Framework is called the runtime. It's also known as the Common Language Runtime. You'll see it called as the CLR as well. And really it's just this protective bubble that wraps around your application. Your application lives inside of it. It runs inside of that protective bubble. And it essentially takes care of a lot of the low-level details so that you, the software developer, you can focus on what your application is supposed to do, not worry so much about how it's actually accomplishing it under the hood. You don't have to worry about the computer's operating system interacting with it, and interacting with memory, and interacting with, the hardware, the computer itself. Many of those things are kind of abstracted away from you. You don't have to worry about them. Furthermore, the CLR, that runtime, also provides a layer of protection for the end user, so that you, the malicious, evil software developer, you can't do something really bad to somebody's computer without them at least giving you permission to do it in the first place. So without their knowledge and their approval, you're not going to be able to wipe out their entire hard drive, for example. For right now, it's the .NET Framework class library that I really want to focus on, because it's what we used, whether you realize it or not, whenever we were writing our first application. So, for example, in lines 13 and 14, where we did our work, you see console.writeLine, and then you used open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and so on. We were using code in the framework class library that knows how to display text into a console window. All we got to do is say, hey, use this text, stick it in a window. And we don't really care how it does its job. We just care that it did it. Okay. And so the next line of code, this console.read line, it was also really important. We're telling the application to wait for input from the end user before continuing its execution. So again, here we're calling code in the .NET Framework class library that knows how to accept user input. You recall that I used the enter key on the keyboard, and then the application continued on, it exited, and we were back into Visual Studio. So in both of those lines of code, we were utilizing methods that were defined, that were created by somebody at Microsoft to handle that interaction with displaying and retrieving data from the end user. So what were to happen if we were to comment out that line of code? And here, to comment out a line of code, I use 2 forward slashes on my computer. It's over the question mark. And commenting out code simply means that I want those instructions to be ignored. Now, I could have just deleted that line of code completely, but I might want it later. So maybe I don't want to remove it completely. I just want to ignore it for now. Okay. I also might use code comments to write myself some notes to remind myself of something about the application in the future. We'll talk about code comments a little bit later. But if we were to run the application now, watch what happens. Okay, it ran and it's already done. What happened? Well, you might have seen a flicker on screen for like a fraction of a second. The reason was because, hey, it executed this one line of code and it said, well, looks like I'm done here, and it exits out of the application. By adding the read line, we're now stopping execution, waiting for the end user to do something before exiting out. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so next let's talk about the position of the code that we wrote. I made sure to emphasize that you have to write the code in the correct place, and the correct place was in between the opening and closing curly braces of that innermost set of curly braces, as defined kind of by the level of indentation that we saw in the boilerplate code. So if you don't add the code there, we saw what the ramification of that was, right? The application, you'll try to run it, it'll give you a runtime error. The correct place for that code was where we have it right now, in between that opening and closing curly brace that you see on screen. Now, as you can see, there's several sets of curly braces, and so it's important that we talk about what these do. And I need to oversimplify things here. We will come back and fill in some of the details later. But essentially, you have an opening and closing set of curly braces, and those define a code block. And code blocks typically have names, and they have purposes. So in this particular case, we have a first code block, and this code block has the name main. Okay, and this particular code block is known as a method, and this particular method, by convention, is the very first method that's called whenever your application is executed. All right, and so I don't want you to worry about these other words, static and void, and even the string and the args for right now. We'll talk about those later on. But this entire code block here, as well as the line above it, they define something called a method. And a method is simply a block of code that has a name. Now later on, you're going to come to realize that a method is so much more than that, but I want to use that as a working definition as we're getting started here. The method has a name, and when you have a name, you can call a name and say, I want you to execute. All right. And so we'll talk about methods again a little bit more in a little while. This main method lives inside of another set of curly braces, and that set of curly braces also have a name. The name is program. It's a class called program. And so you can think of a class as simply a container for all of the methods of your application. You can kind of keep the methods that are related to each other in separate classes. Now, what do I mean by related to each other? Well, That's really for you, the developer, to decide. As you get deeper into programming, you're going to come to understand the thought process behind organizing your code. But that's a little ways off for now. Just trust me on that. Now, I said that a class was merely a way to organize your methods. It is so much more than that. And again, I'm way oversimplifying this as we're getting started here. But the main takeaway for right now is that that code is organized in curly brace containers, and you have some blocks of code that reside inside of other blocks of code. And to kind of emphasize that again, here we have another set of curly braces, and this set of curly braces has a name as well. In fact, it's a namespace called Hello World, which happens to be the name of the application that we gave it. Again, keep things extremely simple here. A namespace is just another way of organizing code. Again, at some point it becomes so much more than that, but let's keep it simple for now. So let's take a look at these lines of code and kind of illustrate these ideas about namespaces that contain classes that contain methods. Here what we're doing whenever we're calling console.writeLine is we're actually making a call into the .NET Framework class library. Remember, it's that library of code supplied by Microsoft, and we're saying in that entire library there's a book, and there's a chapter inside of that book that I want to reference. All right. So in this case, we're saying that book is the console book, the class, and I want you to look at the chapter named WriteLine that has the definition for this method. All right. Hopefully that analogy works for you. But we're looking inside of a library to find a class, and we're going to call a particular method inside of that class. And by using its name, we can execute all the code that was written inside of that method. Same with the method that we're calling below it as well. Notice that there is a period that we use between the name of the class and the method name, and we use that. It's called a member accessor. It allows us to access a member of the class, or in other words, now that we know what the book is, we can find out what chapter we want to reference. Okay, hopefully that analogy works for you. Now notice also that both, whenever we call the WriteLine method and the readLine method, that they both have parentheses following them. Now, in the case of the WriteLine method, we're actually sticking something in between the opening and closing parentheses, whereas in the readLine method, we're not. But essentially, those parentheses are saying not only do we want to reference that particular class method name, but the parentheses mean I want you to actually invoke it, execute it, do it now. Okay, so that's the purpose for those parentheses. Now, we can say do it now and pass in information. Do it now with this stuff, with this argument. So we're passing in an argument to the WriteLine method and saying, we want you to do it, write this to screen, and here's what we want you to write. So it's an input parameter to the method named WriteLine. Okay. Now don't worry, we're going to come back to the notion of methods in the future, as well as passing values into a method like we did as we passed in the literal string hello world into our method here. Just know that whenever you see parentheses after a given word in your code, you should be thinking that that code is being called right now as we step through the execution of the code. Next up, let's talk about the semicolon. We've already kind of explained it in the previous video, but just to kind of emphasize it, notice that almost everything, even these statements at the very top, have semicolons, with the exception of whenever we're defining a namespace, a class, or a method. And we said at the time that these semicolons are actually similar to the period or exclamation mark or question mark at the end of an English sentence. It completes a thought in C#. Now, some programming languages, like Visual Basic, for example, they don't really have this idea. They only allow one complete thought per line of code. However, with C#, you could do this, what I'm about to do. Watch. Okay, now I have both of those lines of code on a single line. All right, and if we run the application, it'll work just as it did before. All right. So the way that you separate or indicate that you have two different complete thoughts is through the use of a semicolon. Furthermore, we could put lines of code on separate lines like this. Now, it wouldn't make sense in this case because the line of code is so short. It actually makes it difficult to read, but sometimes when you have a very, 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 very long line of code, you'll see me split that line of code into multiple lines, and still the application will execute. Now, in other programming languages, you wouldn't have that behavior, all right? Because really, white space and line feeds and things of that nature, they don't matter to C#. The only thing that really matters is to indicate a complete thought is a semicolon at the end of the line. Let me go ahead and get rid of all that. And the other thing that I want to mention here that you may have noticed is the level of indentation that you get automatically from Visual Studio. Now that's completely optional, and Visual Studio nudges you in the right direction, but essentially, even if you were to kind of come out here, and we'll use the tab key several times and write the word console.writeLine, something like that, and notice that Visual Studio re-indented it for us. Why do you suppose it did that? Well, many people believe that indentation helps the readability of the code so that you can see what code container, where code resides inside of the other curly braces inside of your application. All right. And so kind of along those same lines, for readability's sake, notice that there are many different colors that are used as text inside of this text editor window. You have these royal blue colors, and these are my default colors. Yours might look a little bit different, but by default, I think you have some royal blue, some black. You have aqua color here. This is a dark red. You have some light gray and light blue. All right, and all of those are used to help you identify the parts of speech, I guess you can say, inside of the code that you write. All right, we'll talk more about that as we talk more about the syntax of C# in an upcoming lesson. Okay. All right, so now that we've talked about the code that we wrote and its position and formatting and white space and tabs and all that sort of stuff, what I want to do is stop right now for this video, and in the next one I want to talk about the files themselves, the file that we typed our code into, how that relates to projects and even solutions, what happened when we saved our project, what happened when we actually ran our project, and so we'll do that in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. Next, we're going to talk about how code files are organized into projects and solutions, and then where you can actually find these projects and solutions on your hard drive. So whenever we created a new console project, the program.cs file was opened for us automatically in the main area in Visual Studio. And that's one of the things that project templates do for us. Whenever we choose File, New Project, and we see the New Project dialog, and we choose a project template, they provide a great starting point for the type of application that we want to build. It includes files with boilerplate code, important settings, and other resources that we might need whenever we're building that type of application. So as you can see, we're working inside of this file in the main area, and there's a series of tabs. Again, this isn't intended to be an overview of Visual Studio, but it's important to note that the names of the code files that you're working on are contained inside of those tabs. And if you take a look over to the right-hand side, here is the Solution Explorer window, and it has a tree-like structure of all the items that are kind of contained inside of our project. Now, again, as I said at the outset of this course, this isn't intended to provide a tour of Visual Studio per se, and there are other resources on Microsoft Virtual Academy that can really help orient you to using Visual Studio and the various windows and functionality that it contains, but the Solution Explorer is probably the most important part of Visual Studio next to this main area where you'll usually see the text editor and other designer windows. So simply put, the Solution Explorer is our main navigational device to the other files and settings that comprise our program. So you can see here that there is a program.cs file. Now if I were to close the program.cs tab in the main area, I can always get back to it and open it up again by double-clicking it inside the Solution Explorer. All right, you can see it's open once again. Now files and important settings are organized into a concept called projects. So you can see here this word hello world is actually a project. You can see there's a little C# icon next to it letting us know that this is a C# project specifically. And projects get compiled into a single .NET assembly, which we'll talk about later. Furthermore, one or more projects are organized into solutions, and you can see in the Solution Explorer we have one solution here at the very top, solution also named Hello World, that contains one project. Now, in many cases as you're getting started, you're only going to have one project inside of one solution. But as you come to build more complex applications over time, it's highly likely that you're going to need to manage multiple projects that are somehow related. Now again, the reason might not be obvious at this point, but as you continue to learn C# and how to build more complex applications for large companies or for yourself, this becomes a crucial code management strategy. But just for now, accept the fact that there's this extra layer of a solution, and one solution can contain one or more projects, and the projects will contain then all of the code files and the settings and the like that will be used to create an actual executable program. So trust me, these concepts will become more important after we get past the basics. Now the big question at this point should be, where are all these projects and solutions and files actually stored on your hard drive? I mean, can we see them? We can see them in the Solution Explorer. Where are they actually on your hard drive? Well, when we created this Hello World project, we merely provided the name of the project, you'll recall, and then I said go ahead and accept the other defaults. By default, Visual Studio will put your projects into your Documents folder. So if you take a look here and we navigate into the Documents folder, it will put your projects into whatever version of Visual Studio you're currently using. So you can see I have side-by-side Visual Studio 2013 and 2015. We're using 2015 for this series, but it could be a future version of Visual Studio. You'll look in that particular folder for your version of Visual Studio. And as we drill in, there will be a projects folder, and as you drill in you can see that by default when we created our new project it put it here in our document / Visual Studio whatever version / projects folder. Okay, so as I add more projects, this obviously will be filled up with folder names for those projects. And it's important to note that whenever you create a new project, you don't have to create it and put it right here. You can put it anywhere. And so to keep things organized, you're typically going to keep them in the same place. Now, furthermore, you can actually open up a project that's saved anywhere on your computer as well. So, for example, I have this, in this course, I'll supply the projects. After I record the video, I'll zip them up and you'll be able to download them and then open them up on your own hard drive and then walk through them and to better understand them. And so just to kind of demonstrate how you do this, I have this project called, is zipped up into a file called example.zip. And so what I'm going to do is actually right-click this and select Extract All, and then in the Extract Compressed Zip folders, I'm just going to put this on my root, so C:/example, and then click Extract. And so now you can see that on my local hard drive I have an example folder, and inside of that folder there is another folder with a file called example.sln. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I can either double click this .sln file to open up the solution inside of Visual Studio, like so. All right, or I could go to File, Open, Project Solution, and then navigate to that directory using the Open Project dialog, if it'll let me. Okay. All right, and unfortunately it's a little bit too large for the recording area, but then I would just simply select the solution that I wanted to open from this dialog, and then click the Open button. All right, let's go ahead and close that. And let's shut down this copy of Visual Studio, and I want to get back to where we were just a moment ago in our Documents, Visual Studio, in my case Visual Studio 2015 Projects folder, and here are a list of all the solutions in our project folder. And so just kind of want to walk our way through this. This first folder here will contain our solution files. So there's this .sln file, which is a solution file. It contains information about all the projects that are under this umbrella solution. Okay, and we could actually open this up and look at it inside of Notepad, and it's simply just a configuration file. There's nothing all that special about it. You certainly don't want to make any changes to it, but it's going to have information about all of the locations for the various projects that are associated with this solution, any global settings, and some of these things won't really be useful to us until we get deeper into our understanding of compilation and things of that nature. But inside of the solution folder is a second folder which is actually going to contain the project files. And so here we have a hello world.csproj, which is the a project file, the C# project file, and this file will contain, let's open that up as well with Notepad. It'll contain references to things like all the files that are associated with this project and any of the settings and any other metadata. Again, information in here that you certainly don't want to edit, and you don't want to accidentally make any changes to it whatsoever. But I just wanted to make you aware of it, that there's really nothing magical going on. There's just these configuration files that contain information about your project, and as you make settings on the project level, those will be saved inside of that CS project. And then finally, there's this bin folder here, and the word bin typically is short for binary, which denotes that this is where a binary version of your application will be stored. So the process of compilation, it takes your source code, and which is human readable, and it's going to convert it into a format that is machine readable or understood by a machine, your computer. And so if we were to take a look inside of this folder, we would see that there is a debug folder. And so this folder is created for us whenever we started debugging our application. It creates a temporary version of our application for debugging purposes, which we'll talk about later. If we drill into that, you'll see that there is actually an executable file and several other helper files for the purpose of debugging. We'll talk about these later. If I were to double click the hello world.exe, it actually executes our application. All right. And so, you know, compiling your code into a working application is the end goal, but I don't want to talk about compilation just too much yet, or about creating a debug version versus a release version of your .NET assembly, of your compiled code. I think you're going to get a better appreciation for those ideas after we get past some more of the basics. So what I want to do is just stop our conversation about the bin directory right now, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But you're doing great. Let's continue on. We'll start learning more C# now that we have some of these tangential topics out of the way. Or I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks.
That's all for this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be extremely happy to clear all your doubts. If you have missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or you can watch it online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights or on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Hour of Code brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.